Ladies and gentlemen, today is November the 2nd, 2025, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Hello?
Smith. Yo.
Hey, how are you?
Doing well. Enjoyed overeating today, and then a couple Dota games before our discussion.
What did you overeat?
Some chicken and baked potato. Potatoes are
That
very
could be
good.
pretty good.
Yeah. Everything homemade. Really nice seasoning on the chicken. I think I had two thighs and legs. And some other stuff.
Nice.
Streams have been good. I did a bunch of different games for Halloween. I played GTFO yesterday with a squad of 4, which is what it's meant for. That was a good time.
I remember that.
Yeah.
How is it?
It's a very well done game. It's like semi-horror survival. The stuff in it is pretty scary. You're working with low light conditions. It's not super jump scary. It's more so like dealing with waves of enemies that are pretty difficult. But yeah, very well done game. Definitely not a game where you're playing as like storied heroes and stuff. You look like mutated prisoners. So it's not a very pretty game. It's more like horrifying. But that's cool. Yep. And then I played a sort of like platformer semi-horror game called Little Nightmare, or Little Nightmares 3, I think it's called. And then played some Vermintide 2, which is very good. Yeah. Then what else? Oh,
that's
Repo.
right, it was Halloween.
Yeah, Halloween this week.
I keep forgetting.
Played Repo as well. And those 3 games I played with Chai. Repo is very funny. You're like sneakily trying to repossess items, but they're monsters in the rooms and stuff.
That's pretty fun.
Some robots, yeah. So you're kind of shopping around for valuables and then trying to carefully move them to extraction points without getting caught by these different types of scary monsters. And I had 2 costumes. One of them was Fezzik from Princess Bride, the giant. And then the other one was Gene Simmons of the band Kiss, where they have that like metal-looking face paint.
Interesting choices.
Yep. The Kiss one became available to me because our family was going to all go as the band members to this dinner where the restaurant, they also dress up there for Halloween.
Really?
But we ended up vetoing that and then going with Princess Bride. So our whole family was dressed up as different characters from the Princess Bride.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, you guys have fun, don't you?
Yeah. We party.
Nice.
Very nice.
Sounds like a good week overall.
Mm-hmm. I got over my downswing in Dota and I've been climbing again quite well. Terrorblade's my main MMR winner because you get to make a bunch of illusions and use a bit more of the macro and multitasking that you develop playing StarCraft 2. Mm-hmm.
Well, I wish I could say I had been that productive this week. I've mostly been reading and binge watching.
Nice.
Wanted to take a break from the coding, so got a streaming subscription, and I've been trying to move through my to-watch list.
Anything noteworthy that you watched?
I finally watched both seasons of Andor, and I think I also got through X-Men 97.
Oh, sweet.
So those have been on the list for a while, so it was nice to finally get them out of the way.
I've seen Andor season 1, but not season 2. And X-Men 97, I think I've seen most of the first season of it.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's pretty good stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the theme of that one is kind of going back to form of more of the original that people remember rather than the modernized characters.
Wait, which series are we talking about?
X-Men 97.
Ah,
Because it's sort of meant to
kinda.
be done in the older art style still.
Yeah, but they definitely updated it, like thematically and in terms of storytelling. They're taking full advantage of the fact that they're not really restrained by network television anymore.
Yeah.
So that was pretty fun.
Do you have a favorite X-Man or X-Woman?
Oh God. Probably back when I was a kid I did, but I don't really remember anymore. Nothing's coming to mind anyway. Probably something esoteric. Because I used to read the comics a bit back in the day. Yeah, that's a whole topic of conversation unto itself.
I like Nightcrawler and Wolverine.
Good choices. Classic 80s choices.
Yeah. Teleporting around just seems really badass. And his, like, devilish look is pretty cool, too. And then, yeah, Wolverine's a classic. Hugh Jackman is an awesome Wolverine. Deadpool versus Wolverine was really fun. Or Deadpool and Wolverine.
Oh, yeah, that was another one I got off the list.
Oh, you saw that this week, too?
Yeah, that was one of them.
I thought that one was good. It was kind of, like, simple, fun, and fan service. Like, what people would expect. With a decent amount of poking fun at Marvel. Just kind of Deadpool's role.
Lots of meta humor.
Mm-hmm. He's a Marvel Jesus.
Well, was there any drama from the past week you particularly wanted to get to?
Yeah, I asked chat before we got started, and the things that were mentioned were Israel-Palestine update with the hostages release, what the status would be on a ceasefire or something like that, and then U.S. threatening Nigeria, like doing military action there, which I didn't hear about, but he's laughing, so I guess it's not that serious, maybe.
Neuro, we live in very stupid times.
Oh, what's the stupid that happened this time?
Well, basically, Trump posted a message on the, what was it, Truth Social. And he was ranting about how Christians in Nigeria are persecuted, and that if the Nigerian government doesn't stop it, then the United States will intervene to protect Nigeria's Christian population. Yeah, kind of came out of left field. War in Nigeria, I don't think was on anybody's 2025 bingo card.
Who is persecuting the Christians? Are they...
Mostly it's militias, specifically either bandit militias or Islamist militias, more so in the north of Nigeria. Although I don't think, other than in the case of the jihadis anyway, that they're really going out of their way to persecute the Christians. It's more just localized banditry, just sort of generic violence. It's not explicitly religious or political violence. There's an issue with jihadis in the northeast of Nigeria, and then increasingly in the north generally, kind of bleeding over from various other conflicts in neighboring countries in the Sahel. But it's not so endemic that I think it can be said that they're just outright being persecuted and systematically killed. That's a stretch. And I suspect that Trump basically just repeated what the last guy he talked to was. So probably some Christian conservative lobbyist probably talked to him about this and spun it into some big thing that they wanted him to do something about. I'm pretty dubious that the United States will actually intervene in Nigeria. I mean, the whole thing is stupid on multiple levels. I mean, for one, Christians are not being persecuted systematically in Nigeria. They have been, again, targets of low level violence. But Muslims have been just as impacted by that, if not more so, given that most of that violence is happening in the north of Nigeria, which is Muslim majority. Most of the Christians in Nigeria live in the south. And there hasn't been nearly as much violence there because, again, most of the violence relates to instability in the Sahel, and southern Nigeria is not in the Sahel. It has more in common with other coastal regions of West Africa.
Yeah, I figured Nigeria is one of the more developed and high economy countries in Africa. So,
yeah, relatively, it's a petro state, so it's developed in the same way that like the Gulf states are. They make a lot of money from oil exports, but the government is very corrupt. Prototypical resource curse case study, basically, and also the population is massive. In the Gulf states, the population is very small, so the amount of oil revenue they get per capita is very high. And so the government has lots of money it can just kind of spend on bribing people not to revolt or demand more money. In Nigeria's case, the population is something around like 200 million people. Something in that vein by now, I imagine. So that's too many, basically, for per capita oil export money to really be sufficient to stop people from basically suffering from prototypical developing country type poverty. So between that fact and the fact that a lot of the money is just stolen anyway by a corrupt political elite means that I would not necessarily describe Nigeria as being relatively developed. I think it has more money than other West African countries that do not have oil export revenue that they can tap. But unfortunately, the Nigerian government has not been able to leverage that into actual substantive economic development, at least not as of yet. But you're right that it is relatively powerful. It is a regional power in West Africa, in fact, the regional power. And they do have more access to more resources, more funds, basically, than pretty much any other government in the region. So they are a heavyweight in that sense. But that hasn't meant that they have been able to completely suppress instability in their northern regions. They, like other countries in West Africa, have really been struggling with that for much of the past 10 years, which is another reason this is stupid, because there's not really anything new happening. I'm not aware of any significant uptick in violence targeting civilians in northern Nigeria in the past year. As far as I know, the tempo is pretty much the same. And it's especially stupid, too, because as far as I know, the United States is already helping the Nigerian government with insurgents and bandits and whatnot. That was a part of the response to Boko Haram, which was that Islamist group that they got famous in international news because they raided a school. I believe they were called the Chibok Girls. Something like 200 or so, I don't remember the exact number, were kidnapped and over time forcibly married off to insurgents. And many of them faced very difficult experiences, I'm not sure what the right word would be, in captivity.
Damn.
So much so that among the few that managed to be rescued, many of them had a hard time sort of reintegrating into normal society. Because again, a lot of them have been married off, had children, and then suddenly found themselves separated from their nominal husbands, but still saddled with the children, which of course they didn't want to leave behind. And in very conservative cultures, being a divorcee or a sexual assault victim, however you prefer to frame it here, generally means it's very difficult to get married again.
Yeah.
So these girls have suffered a lot, to put it mildly.
And what did we do
so,
to intervene with that?
Basically, we offered to provide expertise, advisory, basically advice, and some intelligence and logistical support. Nothing too substantive. It was just part of a broader project in the Sahel to help governments in the region deal with jihadist groups of one sort or another. And that mission was present has been present in West Africa for, what, like 15 years now, if not further back. It was more centered in places like Chad and Niger, where the United States had a couple of air bases, mostly drone bases, more than fully fledged air bases. And the United States also operated some special forces groups out of those bases in order to assist local governments with particularly active jihadist groups or groups that were planning some pending attack or what have you. Yeah, I remember there was one special forces group that was ambushed during, I think, a raid or something, and some of the body cam footage, it probably isn't what it was. There was some kind of footage that the soldiers themselves had been taking while they were on the mission, and that got captured because I think they were wiped out. There was only like 2 or 3 of them, and they were killed in the ambush, and then the footage made it online. So you don't hear a whole lot about American servicemen in West Africa, because a lot of that stuff is relatively clandestine, but it has been happening consistently for the past 15 years, or at least it had been until the rash of coups in the region resulted in a series of changes in government that resulted in the United States losing access to those bases. So since then, American intervention in the Sahel has reduced in tempo, but I don't recall Nigeria ever ending its relationship with the United States military. So as far as I know, the US government is still there helping them. So the idea now that the United States government is suddenly going to make a big stink about the Nigerian government not doing anything about this threat that it actually is dealing with and has been dealing with the help of the United States for the past 10 plus years. I don't know what caused that. That seems like utter and complete bullshit. Trump himself may not know anything about it, or if he does, he's just bullshitting here to pander to an interest group, presumably conservative Christians. I would add that the fact that the U.S. is assisting Nigeria also makes the threat to intervene in Nigeria particularly silly, because we are technically already intervening. So the whole thing is just stupid. I'm assuming that this is just political theater. This is just posturing to pander to a very particular political group. Again, presumably conservative Christians who do go out of their way to try to highlight violence that is perpetrated against Christian groups in other countries and advocate for the United States government to do something about it. I would assume that one such group managed to actually talk to the president and get him to announce this. But as always with the Trump administration, I'm deeply skeptical there will actually be any follow-through to this. If there is, it'll be even dumber. It's dumb enough as is. But the idea of the United States intervening in a country because it's not doing enough to protect Christians, despite the fact that the United States is itself actively helping that country's military do exactly that, albeit protecting the general population rather than just that specific group. That's just the height of 21st century stupidity. So we'll see. We'll see how dumb the government gets with this. But for now, I'm thinking it's just more bullshit. Probably in a month's time, we won't even remember it.
I see. But I would guess the cheap talk is going to make some people happy, so.
Yeah, for sure.
And then there was some Venezuela mention this week.
Yeah, that's the other dumb business going on. So there's been more news about the U.S. military building up in the Caribbean. And the U.S. government is kind of going out of its way to sort of feed this impression. I think a carrier battle group was relocated to the Caribbean. I think it was the USS Ford. And I think there's also a Marine Expeditionary Unit that's been deployed. The U.S. government has also been very visibly building up air assets, F-35s. They buzzed Venezuelan airspace with B-52s and a B-1 Lancer. And supposedly they're building up logistical centers in the Caribbean. I think there's an island near Puerto Rico called Roosevelt Island, if I'm not mistaken, that the U.S. Navy had basically withdrawn from 20 years ago. But the Trump administration has been building up the base again in order to build up the logistical capacity in the region. So all of this suggests that the Trump administration is building up the U.S. military in the Caribbean for some kind of sustained military operation. And of course, they've suggested that the target of that is going to be Venezuela. They've already been blowing up boats in the Caribbean around Venezuela, although they actually did hit one in the Pacific a couple weeks ago. But mostly it's been in and around Venezuela. And so presumably this is part of an effort then, that is to say the military buildup in conjunction with the airstrikes on alleged narco boats, boats engaging in the trafficking of drugs, to intimidate the Venezuelan government into something. Like, that's still not really clear. Occasionally, it's been suggested that the government wants the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, I believe, to step down, because he is basically the de facto dictator of Venezuela at this point. That's not going to happen. I don't think he sees any reason to do that. People had been asking me about this on here before, and I said that it was almost certainly kayfabe. And I still think that. Military buildup notwithstanding, I think this is just more cheap talk. Because I don't think the Trump administration is actually interested in a full-on regime change style conflict with Venezuela. That would get very messy very quickly and has all the potential to turn into another Iraq-style quagmire. Because for those of you who don't know, people in Latin America very much resent American interference in their affairs. That's a very long-standing feature of Latin American foreign policy. Even political parties and actors that are nominally sympathetic to the United States and are of a like mind on things like markets, the Cold War when that was still going on, and other issues of relevance to foreign affairs, even they are dubious about American interference because they don't entirely trust American intentions. You can go back and study Latin American foreign policy back in the early mid-20th century, and even in that time when they were nominal allies with the United States. In fact, during World War II and just before, under the good neighbor policy of the Roosevelt administration, relations with Latin America were probably better than they've ever been. Even during that period, there was an immense amount of paranoia and skepticism about American intentions, and that made it difficult for cooperation to be substantive. So relations have not improved since then. There's been a number of American interventions in the region that were seen as unjustified, violating the region's sovereignty, and also being extremely violent. I don't know if probably everybody here has heard about Operation Condor by now, because this is kind of an older crowd. But for those of you who have maybe not heard about it, that was an operation that was supported and partly planned by the CIA in conjunction with intelligence agencies in the southern cone region of Latin America, specifically Argentina, Chile, Brazil. I haven't heard about Paraguay and Bolivia as much, but I imagine they probably participated as well. And it was part of a broad-based effort to kind of root out insurgents. Supposedly these were either urban guerrillas or just generic guerrillas that were aligned with the Soviet Union, if not actually coordinating with them. And the effort was, as I said, very violent. They ended up targeting not just actual guerrillas, but anybody they thought might be of a like mind. So civil society leaders that had a left-wing bent, student council leaders of one kind or another at universities, union leaders, anybody who had some kind of institutional role in a left-wing themed organization was liable to be targeted. And these people would be kidnapped, disappeared, tortured, raped, etc., and then eventually killed. And this resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of people in the region. And the United States, in general, people in the region blamed their own governments mostly for that, because, of course, military juntas of one kind or another were responsible. And there was no shortage of people that liked it, that wanted it to happen, because they either thought it was justified or just really hated the left. Latin America has its own politics, so no surprises there. But the United States was implicated in that. It was involved, and there's a great deal of enmity in South America over that, if not Latin America generally. So as a result of that, even groups that are sort of conservative and right-wing prefer to keep their distance from the United States unless they have something that they really want from the United States, unless there's some mutually beneficial plan that is in the works. Controlling for that, relations have not been great. And they've improved a lot since the end of the Cold War, because the United States basically stopped intervening in Latin America substantively. Basically, Washington's attitude is, we don't have to care about this anymore, so we can just walk away from this. All of these messy interventions have been nominally justified by the Cold War. Cold War's over, justification's gone, so by and large, they let it slide. I'm sure people would like to argue about how much the United States actually walked away from Latin America after the end of the Cold War, but I have not seen really good evidence of a major American intervention in the region since 1990. I'm pretty dubious about most all of them. So the Trump administration is kind of bringing back a lot of bad memories here by ramping this up. And so I guess the point I'm driving at is that if there were a major American intervention in Venezuela, either clandestine or a full-on actual invasion, not only would Venezuela probably experience a rally around the flag effect and resist it violently for potentially years, the region as a whole would be very upset about it. The Venezuelan government is not popular in the region by any stretch, but that doesn't mean they want to see the United States throw its weight around and topple the government in the region. So I think the Trump administration, at the very least, knows that there's a lot of risk with an actual war. And the Trump administration has historically been relatively risk averse about actual invasions, both in the first term and this term. They prefer to let others do the actual fighting and to use intimidation to try to mitigate the need for actual intervention. So I suspect that if the pattern holds, this Venezuelan buildup, well, the Caribbean buildup and the intimidation of Venezuela is just going to be more cheap talk by the Trump administration. I don't especially know why they've decided to focus on this. Supposedly, they want to fight drug trafficking. That may well be the actual impetus here. But the actual degree to which the Trump administration is going to follow through with its new war on drugs, I'm pretty dubious that it's going to be all that substantive, because there's not all that much they can do without taking on a lot of risk. And I do see them as being fairly risk averse in that regard. So I don't think there's going to be a war. I have read that the administration is considering airstrikes on land targets in Venezuela related to the trafficking of drugs. And some of those targets are actually Venezuelan military. So supposedly the Venezuelan military has been implicated in drug trafficking. That actually is not a stretch. That's probably true. But the administration wants to use that as justification for potentially attacking actual military infrastructure that they think is being used for the trafficking of drugs. So that's not going to be legal. The Trump administration won't care. So that is entirely feasible. I think they could do that. That's much more feasible to me than an actual invasion or even a substantive effort at regime change. But I don't think it's really going to have the desired impact. It might inhibit actual drug trafficking, but it's not going to topple the government. Given what I know about Venezuelan politics, the regime is pretty well entrenched at this point, and the opposition is a mess. And again, actual American intervention in that style is going to turn more people off of the United States than it is of the actual Venezuelan government. So there's potential for fireworks there, but I expect it'll largely play out similar to the airstrikes on the boats. People will be upset, but the broader ramifications will be limited because the actual strikes are not going to actually be that impactful. Keep in mind, all of this is nominally justified by fighting drug trafficking, but most drugs that enter the United States don't enter through like clandestine smuggling boats or light aircraft launching from Venezuelan military air bases. Like, most of the drugs come in through fairly innocuous means. Tunnels under the border, smuggled in through luggage, smuggled through trucks that cross the border, stuff like that. It's not nearly as dramatic as, people trying to come in the dead of night and, leave a drop-off, leave a drug shipment at a drop-off point on a beach somewhere. That's just comic book shit for the most part. But because it's dramatic, the Trump administration seems attracted to it. And so they seem to think that this is worth the effort. But I suspect, again, that this is mostly just a very expensive photo op for the administration. They have a predilection for these. So I can't rule out actual kinetic operations entirely, but I sincerely doubt an actual war is in the cards. Kind of like with Nigeria, I suspect it's mostly cheap talk.
Once again, the go-to strategy, cheap talk.
Yeah, I did have some notes about this. Let me see here. Yeah, there has been some shenanigans here as far as the drug trafficking operation, if you want to call it that, in the Caribbean. And normally operations like this are under the control of Southern Command. If you don't know what that is, that's just one of the commands that the United States divides the whole world into, and that is responsible for individual regions. In the case of the Western Hemisphere, or at least Latin America, that largely falls into Southern Command. So normally an operation like this would be under the supervision of that command structure. But the Trump administration has apparently decided to go in a different direction here. And this is actually despite them actually announcing that initially that SOCOM, Southern Command, would be in control of it. SOCOM's not the right acronym, actually. I think that's something else. Regardless, the administration itself said that Southern Command would be in charge of it, but then they changed their minds like a week later. And they announced that instead it would be led by the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force, which is an unusual choice. Now, this came on the heels of a different announcement that the admiral in charge of Southern Command would actually be stepping down at the end of the year, 2 years ahead of schedule, which surprised a lot of observers. So there seems to be something afoot here. We can't really tell what it is. I don't think it's a war. But I suspect maybe that the administration is bending enough rules that some of the upper echelon of officers in Southern Command are uncomfortable with it, and that maybe this could be the reason why the head of Southern Command decided to resign early, and why the administration decided to shift control of these operations to a Marine Expeditionary Force. It may be that the guy in charge of that is perceived by the Trump administration as being more trustworthy than the officers that are nominally in control of Southern Command. So that's speculation on my part. I can't really prove any of that, but that seems to be the case based off of the observable changes that we've seen. And that's not great. That's some third world bullshit. Juggling military commanders based off of loyalty instead of normal command channels. You kind of can do that. You can pick and choose individual commanders, but generally the norm is to defer to established command structures and to let them run things as they see fit. That is basically how a government would normally defer to their expertise and not micromanage. The Trump administration, as always, doesn't care about norms. And so they've been all about intervening and micromanaging. And so now they've got this one particular guy in charge of this one particular unit who's being given control of a broader operation here than would normally be in his ambit. And the administration doesn't say why, which is itself unusual. So the whole thing is very fishy. And that kind of brings me to my other concern here, to my overarching concern about the operations. It could be the case that the administration genuinely wants to do more about drug trafficking, and that this is how they want to do it. And maybe they have access to intelligence that we're not privy to that suggests this could be impactful. I'm dubious, but that's hypothetically possible. But here's my concern. Even if that's true, how are they doing this? Like, what is the procedure for identifying boats in the Caribbean that are trafficking drugs? Like, how do you do that in practice? Hypothetically, you could have intelligence assets on the ground, or other forms of intelligence, SIGINT or ELINT or whatever, that could alert you to when these boats are traveling and whatnot. What I think might be happening, and given the administration's record and who's populating military institutions, the civilian leadership positions within the military under the Trump administration at this point, I strongly suspect that this could be the case. And my suspicion is that they're using a process that relies on observing the movement of boats in the region, either by radar or other forms of information gathering. And they're using AI. And this is, again, speculation on my part, but I think they might be looking at patterns of movement over time and then using algorithms to try to identify deviations in normal behavior, and then using those deviations as grounds to launch the airstrikes. And the reason I bring that up is because that's basically what Israel is doing in Gaza. So this is not unprecedented at this point. The Israeli military developed algorithms to sort through intelligence faster and more efficiently. And one of the things they did with the onset of the war in Gaza is they significantly loosened the restrictions on how the algorithms could be used and the degree of information. I shouldn't say the degree of information, the degree of confidence that the algorithm had that a given individual was actually a member of Hamas and was a legitimate target. Those standards were very much lessened and loosened. And the result is that they ended up with much larger target sets. And the risk you take when doing that is that you're more likely to hit innocent people. That is to say, people that are false positives. At the same time that they did that, they also loosened restrictions on collateral damage. Before, I think it had been something like 10 to 1 or 20 to 1 was sort of the acceptable range of collateral damage. And once the war started, they increased it significantly to around more 50 to 1. That is to say, 50 people as collateral damage for each genuine, legitimate target. So my concern is that the US government here is doing something similar in the Caribbean, where the procedure for identifying the boats is very weak, basically, in terms of the degree of confidence that they can actually have, that the boats are genuinely running drugs, that they're basically just using an algorithm to create an excuse for them to go after boats and to make a big show of, quote unquote, fighting drugs. So I would reiterate here, that's speculation. I can't prove that. And it could be entirely the case that they have legitimate intelligence and that the airstrikes are actually hitting boats running drugs. It may be that the Venezuelan government has very poor operational security. The Trump administration is not lying when they say the Venezuelan government is involved in drug trafficking. That's long been established. So it could be that the CIA or other intelligence agencies have penetrated the Venezuelan government and are able to get actionable information about when boats are leaving Venezuela and running drugs. That's entirely possible. But given that the administration has gone out of its way to hire some of the most gung-ho loyalist people that they can find, and that Trump himself has an established record of reaching for some of the most dramatic kinetic options in dealing with public policy problems, and given that the Israelis have already showed that you can use AI algorithms to do this, I suspect the combination of all three factors kind of combines to make it relatively likely that they're approaching the problem in the way that I described. We'll see. When the truth comes out, I'm sure we'll be hearing about it in the news. There'll be a big outcry about it. But for now, I can only kind of, again, speculate. But that is my concern. That is sort of what I'm watching here. And that is more what I'm more concerned about that than I am about an actual invasion or a war. Because, again, I see that as just being cheap talk and theater. But for the American government to go out and just start killing people based off of an algorithm, that's a problem. The precedent that sets is much more problematic on a number of levels than the prospect of a war that is the result of just propaganda and cheap talk. And I feel like that should be more what people are focusing on. I think that they're not focusing on it because they can't. We just don't have the information. The federal government at this point, under this administration, tends to be relatively opaque about these kinds of things. So we probably won't hear about it in detail until several months, maybe even years. Also, fun fact, President Trump, quote unquote, authorized the CIA to take action in Venezuela. He did not say what he was authorizing them to do or what the mission would be. I think he mentioned something vaguely about fighting drug trafficking and immigration. But otherwise, it was just sort of one of those vague social media posts he puts up sometimes in which he talks big, but doesn't really doesn't really elaborate on what exactly that means. Mm. I would point out that destabilizing Venezuela is not going to do anything to fight drug trafficking or immigration. In fact, the pattern is very much the opposite. When countries destabilize, the tendency is for them to produce more migrants and more drug trafficking. Overthrowing a government is definitely not going to fix any of that stuff. So that's pretty much all I had. That's the gist of it. This is very much a wait and see story that is still developing.
Gotcha. The only other thing that was mentioned was update on Israel-Palestine.
I really don't have one. I mean, it's basically a broken record at this point. The Israelis allege that Hamas, or maybe individual Palestinians, violate terms of the ceasefire. They blow some shit up. Hamas complains about it, and then things settle down again. That's been the pattern since the ceasefire. It seems to happen at least once a week, if not more often. Mm-hmm. But in general, the ceasefire is holding for now. But there's not much else happening that I'm aware of. Presumably negotiations to kind of elaborate on the details of the peace deal are ongoing. Because what they did was only like the first part of the deal, basically phase one. And, as we talked about before, they negotiated that, and we're in the process of negotiating the other parts of the deal when the Trump administration kind of parachuted in and demanded that all parties involved move forward with the first phase of the deal without finishing the other phases. So presumably that's the focus right now, trying to figure out what the rest of the deal is going to look like and how they're going to implement it. I haven't heard any updates about that, so again, presumably ongoing. And as I said last time, I'm pretty skeptical about the prospects, so probably the negotiations will fail and they will return to fighting at some point within the next couple weeks or months.
Well, what else has happened?
Stuff.
Nice.
Myriad stuff. Let's see. Oh, have you heard about the this isn't really world per se, but it is relevant to the United States. Have you heard about the Voting Rights Act drama?
No, where?
This is here in the U.S. This is a federal case that's moving through the courts. I think it's in front of the Supreme Court as we speak.
Oh, damn.
Yeah, so this is this could be a dramatic one. If this actually plays out the way some people are worried that it might, you're definitely going to be reading about it in the news. Yeah, so the Voting Rights Act, it's pretty well known in the United States, but for those of you outside the United States, the Voting Rights Act was a important piece of legislation that was passed in 1965. And it basically ended, what's the word I want? Legal discrimination against African Americans in the United States. Specifically, it made it illegal for the South, which was principally the target of the legislation, to use various ways and means to stop Black people from voting. So that was that obviously was a big deal. The trouble was in the implementation, because how do you actually do that in practice? So for one, they banned a whole bunch of various means of formal discrimination that had been well established in the South. But they also took note that even if Black people could vote, the actual electoral system of a given state could be bent and modified and warped such that they were de facto disenfranchised. So one of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act, let me see if I can find it here, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, stipulated that states with a history of discrimination against certain protected classes could have their electoral laws basically be forcibly brought under the review of the judicial system, the national judicial system, under the courts. I'm not a lawyer, by the way, so I'll just apologize for those of you who have to suffer through listening to me try to describe this. This is my best effort here. But that was the gist of it. Section 2 basically allowed the courts to oversee any would-be changes that certain select states, in other words, southern states, made to their electoral systems. And that was in place, that has been in place since 1965, so basically for roughly half a century now. The trouble with that is that it was never meant to be permanent. The idea was not to create a permanent sort of separate class of states that would not have full sovereignty over their electoral system. It was meant to address a very specific problem, that being discrimination that existed at the time, but that was intended to be dealt with over time, and such that eventually the special oversight by federal courts could end. And that's long been the knock against Section 2. Like, this is not really a new criticism per se. And that's led some people to advocate for its modification or removal or what have you. As you can imagine, the counter argument is that, yes, it's an issue that this doesn't really have a clear sunset provision, that you can basically just force states to sacrifice some of their, constitutional right to run their electoral systems how they want. But the issue, of course, is that the underlying problem with discrimination has not really gone away. That's still a thing. So the question then becomes, the debate then becomes, how do we determine the degree of discrimination that it exists, and how do we decide when we need to end these special provisions in order to give a state a chance to prove that it can run its electoral system without discriminating? And, again, I'm a layman. I don't really know all the details. That's my rough understanding. But that is where the debate is before the Supreme Court right now. And the way the Supreme Court has been ruling recently and has been talking about this case specifically and issues adjacent to it, there's a very strong suspicion amongst legal observers that I've read that the court is actually going to rule in a way that ends Section 2 oversight over the South's electoral systems. So that may actually come to an end for the first time in about half a century, in which case Southern states will be fully able to change their electoral systems however they want in a way that is extremely discriminatory, like clear-cut discriminatory. And I think it's no guess who they would target. It would almost invariably be African-American voters. So I don't think we're looking at a return to like poll taxes and poll tests and poll fees and all that kind of stuff. I don't think Jim Crow is coming back, but the electoral shenanigans that coincided with those things, that could be coming back. And it's entirely possible that they could do this in a way that increases the number of seats the Republican Party controls in the House of Representatives by a significant number that would give them a semi-permanent majority in the House for potentially decades. So this has all of the potential to be an extremely impactful court ruling.
Damn.
And a lot of the legal community is paying very close attention to it on that count. But there hasn't been a ruling yet, so hasn't really been in the news as much. But when the ruling drops, you're definitely going to be hearing about it, especially if they rule the way that they think they will.
Fuzzy Cobra saying we do have some leftover questions from last time that we didn't get to.
Yeah. Let's see. Poland said they will... Yeah, we haven't really talked about Ukraine in a while. Poland said they will arrest Putin if he flies over Poland to Hungary, if there is a meeting there, and I was wondering if other countries like Romania might do the same. Also, if Putin being stuck in a landlocked country surrounded by countries that might not let him fly out might influence negotiations. So I don't think we talked about it, but there was supposed to be a meeting between Trump and Putin, I think a week or two ago. And so there was some talk about how Putin would actually get to the meeting, because it was in Budapest, if I remember correctly. And some of the countries between Russia, a lot of the countries between Russia and Hungary have, well, basically they're hostile to Russia. And if given the opportunity, they would likely, given the opportunity to arrest him, because there is technically international warrants and whatnot, allegations of war crimes, etc. Given the opportunity to arrest him and turn him over to the ICC, they would probably do it, one would think. And so that led to some question of whether or not they would even allow him to fly over their airspace, in which case there was some question about how he would actually get to the meeting. So a lot of this was just nonsense, because even if he can't fly over Eastern Europe, he can just go around. That's not a big deal. I don't think there was ever any real threat of him being arrested in that vein. So the whole thing just kind of felt like bizarre social media bullshit that very frequently spins out. But I don't think there was anything substantive there, as far as I know. And I don't think it would have influenced his negotiations to have the negotiations in Hungary, because obviously, even if the countries around Hungary may not be friendly to Russia, Hungary itself very much is. Specifically the Orbán administration, which has been in power now for like 10 years, 15 years. Feels like a very long time. He's been around a while, and he's fairly chummy with Putin. So I'm pretty sure Putin would have been fine, and the negotiations would not have been significantly impacted. Let's see, what are the consequences of Trump's... Yeah, this is another one you may not have heard of, Neuro, since you're not on the social media. Have you heard about the ballroom?
Is this the expensive event he hosted? Or is he renovating something?
Yeah, he's renovating something, all right. I think it's the East Wing of the White House. There's a West Wing and an East Wing. And I want to say it's the East Wing. Chad can correct me if I'm wrong on that. He said some time ago that he wanted to add a ballroom to the East Wing, and that he didn't want to make big changes to the actual East Wing. It would basically just be an addition. And there wasn't much traction on that story for a long time. I myself just kind of wrote it off. But now he is actually moving forward with that. And probably unsurprisingly, he lied about it. He is not going to make an addition. He has actually demolished the East Wing of the White House.
Oh.
Like fully.
It no longer exists.
Yeah, that's not a thing. You can see pictures and footage of the demo work happening. So he's just kind of decided to do that. Oh. And he is now constructing some kind of new ballroom that is going to be where the previous East Wing previously was located. So the question here was, what are the consequences of Trump's demoing the East Wing of the White House? None, because it is technically legal. That is a thing that he can do. I think normally there would be a process by which the administration would consult with various groups, preservation groups, history groups, whatever. There's almost always at least a few that have a vested interest to some degree in things like this, and they tend to scream bloody murder when they're not consulted. But the thing is, the consultation of groups like these was a norm. It was not a law. The administration, the executive in general, not just this administration, is not required by law to consult anybody before making changes like this. It is kind of at the discretion of the president how he wants to remodel the White House. In so much as it hasn't happened much over the course of U.S. history, it's because there just hasn't been much desire on the part of individual presidents to do it. Generally, the facilities of the White House have been sufficient. But additions and changes have been made over time by various presidents. Generally not of this scale, but they have happened and they have been legal. And so Trump here is technically coloring within the lines. This is not like him just being outrageously skirting the law and whatnot. You could accuse him of outrageously skirting norms. That's not unusual for him and his administrations. But there's nothing anybody can realistically do about it. Even if Republicans didn't control both houses of Congress, there probably wouldn't be anything legally they could do to actually stop him on this one. So this is technically legal, and on account of that, there will be no real consequences other than people online complaining about it. Let's see, could I explain current and historical gerrymandering in America? I mean, that's a big topic. That goes all the way back to the 1700s. I don't remember his name, but there was I want to say it was like a governor of Massachusetts colony way back. Again, this would have been like early mid 1700s. I want to say. Could be getting the time wrong. Anyway, his thing is that he was one of the first guys to very obviously gerrymander districts. And that's actually where the name comes from. Gerrymandering refers to this guy, his first name. I think his first name was Jerry. I'm super iffy on the details. It's been so long since I thought about this. The mandering part of the name comes from the fact that the specific district that made it obvious that he was doing this was shaped like a salamander. Mm-hmm. So gerrymandering is a portmanteau of the governor's name and the shape of the district in question. Huh. I'm assuming here everybody knows about America's electoral system, that it uses districts and not proportional voting. So when you have an electoral system like that, you can actually influence how many seats a given party wins by designing a district, by designing all of the districts in a given state in a way that kind of lumps everybody from one party together in a handful of districts, and then splits up the rest of the territory into as many districts as possible. those being the districts that are going to vote for you. And assuming that each district gets one representative in the state legislature, you can then basically predetermine how many seats a given party will hold. So this is the general idea behind gerrymandering. And it's super skeevy. Everybody knows they're not supposed to do it. Some states are better at others than regulating it. Some states have like whole-assed bipartisan commissions that are responsible for autonomously overseeing and regulating a given state's electoral system. Other states don't give a fuck. Other states just kind of run with it. It's basically a tradition in some American states to just do it like this. Texas is one of them, where I live. Everybody gerrymanders, and it's just kind of accepted. And there are efforts at times to kind of reform the system and have it be more bipartisan and less just overtly bullshit, but the party in power kind of likes the way things are as is because they benefit from it, and they have a very clear-cut majority in the Texas legislature, so they're not especially interested in reform. That's pretty much the case across the South. Most southern states operate like this and kind of have. You know, the theme tonight seems to be that the American South is shit at democracy. That seems to be the recurring theme here. A liberal democracy, which seems to be the term we've kind of come to call it in the early 21st century, has relatively deep roots in the South. You know, liberal democracy is common across the United States, but it's always been the weakest in the South. The actual sort of commitment to fully fledged liberal democracy has always been pretty suspect there. And some of that has to do just with slavery and the inequality of a political economy that has historically been almost solely dependent on plantations. I think we talked before about how shit plantation political economies are and how basically every country or territory that has historically had a plantation political economy just does not develop economically. It's like a permanent albatross around their necks, historically speaking. So the American South is not unique in that regard. They sort of suffer from that as well. So partly it's that, partly it's the political economy, partly it's slavery, partly it's just political culture generally. They've always kind of had more of a Scots-Irish approach to democracy, which is very reverent about individual liberty and freedom, but also doesn't do a very good job of building a political culture that is very, I don't want to say mature per se, but that takes it seriously. Like if you want to have first world political institutions, the first thing you need is a political culture that values first world political institutions that are well run, bipartisan, that value certain aspects of democracy over and above just raw majoritarian democracy. And the South has not had that as much historically. Generally, that's been more of a Yankee thing and a Midwestern thing. In the South, it's more about who you know, it's more about networks, it's more about power elite. You know, there's a long history of just local plantation elites absolutely dominating local politics in the South. And it doesn't happen as much now because plantations basically died as significant political forces and because the urban economy has grown so much over time that they have kind of supplanted traditional elites. But the legacy of the previous political economy, which again, dominated by like local powerful elites, a lot of them were called colonels back in the day. The legacy of that still weighs on political culture. You know, the general trend in regional politics in the United States is that even as the structure of underlying economies changes, basically the first people to settle a given region of the United States defines the political culture there forever. You know, it seems to kind of maybe change in degrees over time, but it only ever seems to orbit around that core initial political culture. In the South, that was the Scots-Irish. In the Northeast, it was the Congregationalists, the Puritans and whatnot. In the Midwest, it was sort of an admixture of a lot of different groups. Germans prominent among them, but others as well. So all of these sort of different regions, Neuro knows exactly what I'm talking about. I'm basically just referencing the book that we've read, American Nations. But yeah, that's there is very good evidence for that, and that is where that Southern political culture kind of comes from. That's its origin, and it's been persistent even in spite of the sort of economic development of the South that has occurred since the 1950s, when you started seeing a lot more in-migration. So all of those are reasons why liberal democracy in the South is weaker, and why there's more of a proclivity for, again, what we would now call illiberal democracy in the South. And partly because of the Voting Rights Act, but also just part of broader changes in the federal government and how it regulates corruption, local activism in the South itself. Over the past 50 years, those things have combined to make the South relatively more liberal. Again, if you're familiar with the stream, you know what I mean by liberal, but for those of you who aren't, liberal here is referring to classical liberalism, which is the bedrock of Western civilization, especially in its modern incarnation. And when I say modern, I mean like the past 500 years. So, everybody is liberal in the United States. That is like the dominating, overarching ideology of the United States, in so much as it can be said that we have one. The sort of Enlightenment classical liberalism of political pluralism, rule of law, relatively free markets, etc. Like all of that is the bedrock of politics in the United States. Not everybody has that. Even in Europe, they stray relatively, mostly it's liberal, but they have more alternatives that are more legitimate in European politics than you would see in the United States. It's relatively rare for like a full-on actual anti-liberal or illiberal political party or political force to actually be successful here. But the exception there is, again, in the South, which has a long history of having a somewhat uncomfortable relationship with liberal democracy for the aforementioned reasons. Anyway, gerrymandering.
Gerrymandering exists. People think it's bad because it is.
Yeah. So very, very common in the South for the reasons outlined. You also see it elsewhere, though. It's not unusual to see it in, say, like Maryland. California is very explicitly talking about it right now. They're talking about it more as retaliation for Texas going out of its way to do a mid-decade reform, basically, of its electoral system, of its districts. Normally you sort of rejig your districts and their shape once every 10 years in conjunction with the US Census, which itself happens once every 10 years. But the current government in Texas is sort of breaking with that norm and going out of its way to indulge in explicit gerrymandering in order to increase the number of seats held by the GOP in the House of Representatives at the national level. And so the government of California is talking about retaliating by indulging in some gerrymandering of their own in order to boost the number of Democrats holding seats in the House of Representatives. So this has been in the news more, relatively speaking, over the past year or so on account of this sort of tit-for-tat bullshit. But that's... I'm not sure, how much more detail I can go. Like, that's what gerrymandering is. That's why it's more prominent in some regions than others. I don't think it's going away. I give a lot of credit to the states that actually try to deal with it and take it seriously, but unfortunately, that's relatively few. And given the hyper-partisan environment we're in right now in the United States, it's probably going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, it seems like it would be hard to root it out of the system because the people who are doing it are the people who make the laws and the rules.
Yeah, they benefit the most from it, so why change it?
Mm-hmm.
Therein lie the contradiction.
I want you to enact something that gives your party less power. It's going to be hard for them to say yes to that.
Let's see. What do you think about nuke testing that Trump wants to do? Is there any risk to the public with it? And this is another item from the highlight reel. So Trump recently, I think in the past week, announced that the United States is going to resume the testing of nuclear weapons. This was another, I believe, Truth Social post, so make of that what you will. Maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't. We'll probably learn with everybody else. The impetus here, supposedly, is that other countries have started testing nuclear weapons, and so the United States should as well. It will probably not surprise you to hear that this is a lie. Other countries have not started testing nuclear weapons again. What Russia has done, and increasingly China, is, well, Russia specifically breached agreements regarding the testing of weapons that could be used as nuclear weapons, that could house nuclear warheads, specifically ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. There were enough allegations that they were violating that agreement that the US, I believe under the Obama administration, eventually just pulled out of it. Might have been the first term Trump administration. I don't quite remember the details. But they have been violating that agreement and have continued testing those kinds of weapons since then. And China has as well. But what they have not done is actually just detonate nuclear warheads. They have not been testing nuclear weapons, quote unquote. So Trump here is either misunderstanding what testing nuclear weapons means, or he does know what they mean, and he actually does just want to restart testing for whatever reason. It's not the reasons he says, because those are obviously false, although he may just be mistaken. But I think more likely somebody talked him into doing this because they want to spend more money on the nuclear arsenal. That is an actual thing. The nuclear arsenal does need to be updated. It's pretty old at this point, and there has been on-again, off-again negotiations for much of the past decade regarding how best to do that. So interested parties have been lobbying the government about this for a while. My suspicion is that one of them managed to talk to Trump here and talked him into restarting testing nuclear weapons as an excuse to spend more money on specifically the nuclear arsenal testing and also the renewal of the arsenal. Replacing old weapons, rejuvenating or replacing old infrastructure, etc. Now, as to whether or not this actually poses a threat to the public, probably not, since I don't think they'll actually follow through with it. But if they do follow through with it, it depends. Like, if they actually take it seriously, there is established ground rules for how to safely, and so much as you can do it safely, test nuclear weapons. Generally they do it way out in the boonies and the West, in the Great Basin where hardly anybody lives. So that could be done right. So the question then is, how much do you trust the Trump administration to actually do it right? I imagine everybody will have their own opinion on that. Well, let's see, that's about it for questions, looks like.
Gotcha.
How are we doing on time?
Been going for hour 15.
Gotcha. And what else did I have here? Well, I should ask you, was there something you wanted to get to?
I don't think there was anything else that really stood out to me.
Gotcha. Well, we do have other stuff. We already talked about Ukraine, basically, and the meeting, and it's the cancellation of the meeting. Well, I didn't talk about that, actually. So there was supposed to be a meeting between Trump and Putin, but then it ended up getting canceled. And we didn't really, Trump didn't really elaborate on exactly why. But basically he said, what little we know is what he said, which was that he did not want a, quote, wasted meeting, end quote. And he specifically referenced that there were standing sticking points in the negotiations that suggested that another meeting would be just a waste, would just be a retread of previous meetings. And specifically, the thing he pointed out was that the Russian government continues to refuse to agree to a ceasefire that freezes the current lines of control, basically along the front line, as it stands right now in Ukraine. That's been something that Trump himself and his administration pushed pretty hard in earlier attempts to resolve the conflict. And it seems the Russian government is just utterly intractable in this. They just don't want to do it. And they kind of managed to string along the Trump administration for a while, but it seems increasingly Trump is cottoning on to the fact that he is being strung along. And it seems to be wearing a little thin. Whether that actually means he does anything about it, that's another question. I'm pretty dubious about that. But for now, at least, he's putting a little bit of heat on the Russian government here. Oh yeah, it's also worth mentioning that after the cancellation of the meeting, the Trump administration came out and announced new sanctions on the top 2 Russian oil firms in Russia. And this is the first time they've been sanctioned since the war in Ukraine started. Oil is obviously an important generator of revenue for Russia, but the West decided that discretion was the better part of valor there. They sanctioned other parts of the Russian economy, but it was determined that sanctioning Russia's oil exports could have a dramatic impact on oil prices in the West, which would be very disruptive to Western economies. And so they decided to delay, at least, not cancel completely, but delay sanctioning Russia's oil firms until the West could secure alternatives to a degree that they could be confident that the disruption from sanctioning Russian oil would not be overly disruptive. So Trump now has just decided to kind of move forward with it. Normally, when a government does this, they do it in consultation with allies overseas so that they can have a common position that makes the policy as impactful as possible. Trump doesn't really have a reputation for that, so I doubt that they bothered. Probably probably Europe found out about it when everybody else did, when he decided to announce it. It is a big deal in the sense that it will significantly curb formal oil exports from Russia. There is obviously a large and growing black market in Russian oil, and that no doubt will get much bigger if and when these sanctions go forward. That'll probably, the black market will mute the impact. They will still export a lot of oil. There's things that can be done to inhibit it, but stopping it completely is not in the cards. That's very unlikely. So I give the Trump administration credit here for trying to put pressure on them. This is probably something that's been in the cards for a while. They probably could have coordinated better or timed it better, but they are at least nominally progressing here. However, I would suggest that the announcement of the new sanctions may just be a negotiating tactic. In conjunction with the cancellation of the meeting, the Trump administration may be signaling to the Russian government that the longer it delays giving substantive concessions and peace talks, the harder they're going to go on them. I don't think that's entirely a credible threat, so I don't think the Russian government really cares. There's a limit to how much of the leverage the United States really has here, and there's certainly a limit to how much the Russians think the United States can credibly threaten to escalate, given how reluctant the Trump administration is to actually really jump into Ukraine in a big way. So I suspect that Moscow feels like it has the high cards here and is going to play them accordingly, which means that there's probably not going to be a big change in the trajectory of the conflict in Ukraine or of the corresponding peace talks. I think the only thing that's going to change is the approach that Moscow takes to stringing along the Trump administration. They're going to have to shake things up a little bit. I'm sure they're well prepared to do so. They're fairly smart as far as diplomacy goes. I suspect that'll be the main thing that changes. We'll see what that looks like in practice, but I certainly don't think the Russians are just going to cave in here. Putin seems very committed to his project in Ukraine. We shall see. Let's see. Peru. Peru was in the news. Didn't really talk about it last week because we ran out of time, but yeah, they've been having a bit of drama. They did actually impeach their president.
Whoa.
So she's out. She had an approval rating of somewhere between 2 and 4%.
Damn. It's not very high.
No, it is not. She was not in a good position. And they've been gunning for her for a while. I think for some years, in fact. So it was probably just a matter of time. Well, that time has come. She's on the outs. They have a new president now. Let me see if I can find his name. Jose Harry, I think is his name. I'm almost certainly mispronouncing that, so I'll apologize here. My best guess is Jose Harry. He was a congressional leader. Don't ask me what specific leadership position he held. It's not in my notes. But he was a high-ranking congressional congressman, and he was sworn in as interim president, I think, last week. Normally, it would be the vice president who would become president after an impeachment, but Peru does not currently have a sitting vice president, and so the position had to go to the next guy down the line of succession.
I see.
Yeah, for the exact impetus here, it was crime. There's apparently been a rising tide of crime in Peru, and the government has been getting a lot of heat for it. And so the president became even more unpopular than she already was. There was also apparently a particular inciting incident. There was a shooting at a concert in Lima, the capital. And so that in particular set people off and got people complaining about the crime issue again, to the point where they were able to get the votes to finally impeach her. I would point out that this was not a close vote. It was the overwhelming majority of lawmakers from all across the political spectrum that voted against her.
Is this organized crime groups or just basic individual crime, or both?
My impression was both. The specific examples seemed kind of random, petty violent crime. But I think I have read that there is sort of just all manner of crime. People generally blame Venezuelans for it, if I recall. But it's also locals, just in general. And also the economy is not doing great. It's kind of shaky, especially with all of the fallout from the inflation from the COVID period. A lot of countries in the developing world were hit hard in that regard. And Peru is still kind of recovering. Fun fact, she was impeached on the grounds of, quote, permanent moral incapacity.
Oh, what?
Yeah. Totally unfit to rule, apparently. Other fun trivia here. This was the 6th attempt to impeach her.
Wow. Why did it take so many attempts? They didn't agree.
Didn't have the votes. She had enough support to stick it out. But the longer she stayed in office, the worse her approval rating got. And she finally kind of reached that threshold beyond which she just didn't have the political credibility, strength, popularity, whatever you want to call it, to kind of garner the votes she needed to stay in power. I would point out that she herself assumed the presidency because of an impeachment. I don't know if you remember, but there was a left-wing president elected in Peru. His name was Castillo. And he was a former teacher, kind of a populist left-wing guy. And he was impeached after trying to suspend Parliament. This was after he received a lot of pushback for trying to implement various reforms that were unpopular with his opponents. He swung for the fences as a result and tried to basically seize power. by suspending Parliament. Parliament responded very strongly and basically impeached him overnight, kicked him out. And so that's how the current, well, former now president, I think her name was Boluarte. I do not know how to pronounce that. She was granted the reins in the wake of Castillo's impeachment. And while a lot of people were happy to see Castillo go, obviously his supporters were incensed. And the new president faced a lot of questions about legitimacy. People were accusing her of taking power in a kind of coup or legislative coup, whatever they wanted to call it. Basically, they delegitimized her government, and there was a pretty steady drumbeat of protests and low-level resistance against the change in government. That kind of faded with time, although it would kind of crop back up again. But she was never really able to kind of knock the allegation that she seized the presidency through means that were kind of dubious legality for political partisan reasons. There were enough people willing to give her the benefit of the doubt and kind of let her run the show for a while to try to correct the ship, but she was unable to do so. Basically, she was unable to address the broader problems in Peruvian society, and so now she's become sort of the designated scapegoat. Yeah, there were things she could have done better, and some things were just beyond her, but some things were just beyond her control. Again, the inflation issue, the overarching economic issues, just general political culture in Peru being kind of dog shit for the past 5 years. This is not the first time we've talked about Peru. Peru has basically been in a kind of perpetual political crisis since like 2019, if not further back. It's just been an ongoing series of cascading corruption issues. Well, not even just just various issues of one kind or another. Corruption, political infighting, hyper-partisanship, and it's resulted in a great deal of political instability in Peru. And this is basically just the latest iteration of that ongoing trend, which does not seem to have a clear-cut endpoint. So that's very unfortunate. Hopefully Peru is able to kind of get its shit together here, but that does not seem to be the case, at least for the foreseeable future. We'll see what the new guy can do, the interim president. He may be able to kind of do some things that help, but probably he's not going to be in office long enough for that to happen. Most likely, whoever ends up taking on the position on a non-interim basis is going to be the one to kind of decide that. Kind of pessimistic given the past 10 years, but hey, hope springs eternal. Hopefully whoever ends up as president will be able to kind of leverage whatever amount of support he can get into some tangible gains that result in an end to the on-again, off-again political crises in Peru.
Seems like it's hard to fix systemic issues like that, because if you have corruption as a systemic issue, for you to climb through the political ranks requires you to, in some sense, dip into that well of corruption and benefit from it, or at least win the favor of some of the people. Otherwise, you're not going to get into power. But then once you have the power, how do you uncorrupt it?
Therein lie the rub. Yeah, whole ass books have been written about that. Nobody has a great answer. But let's see. Argentina. Actually, I did finally receive, well, not receive, but find. I did discover I got an email from Dagnip. So if he's out there, I know I have it now, but I only just found out, so I haven't had a chance to respond yet. Yeah, I'm the worst about emails on here. I receive them so rarely, I don't really regularly check, so sometimes people go days or weeks before I respond. Sometimes longer. So I will get back to him eventually. Let's see. So we talked last time about how there was a general election. Malay's party, how well it would do was sort of in question given some poor local election results a couple weeks prior. So markets were kind of in a tizzy about the prospect of his party not doing well, and then potentially drawing his reform era to a premature close. Well, the results are in, and he actually did pretty well. He doesn't have an absolute majority in the legislature, but his party has enough seats to block legislation, which gives them a de facto veto, which they can use as leverage. And I think there's also enough like-minded politicians and parties holding seats in the legislature that they probably could do more reforms. Although I'm sure there's going to be a lot of horse trading, especially given Argentina's political culture. But for now, it seems that the market's worries were not justified. Milei will probably be able to continue with his reforms, or at least will not have to watch his reforms be systematically dismantled by an opposition-controlled legislature. That does not seem now to be in the cards. We'll see what Milei does with it. You know, it's still relatively early in his presidency, even if it doesn't feel like it to his opponents. I'm sure TACNIP is exhausted, but there's probably more to come. That seems to be the takeaway. There are probably more Milei reforms that will now play out. We'll see what that looks like in practice in the coming months. Let's see. Excuse me. So I had a bunch of notes about elections and mass protests. I guess we can kind of run through that.
Sure.
Are we still okay on time?
Yes, we're at about an hour and a half, and we don't have to do the full 3 if it's been a relatively slower week.
Gotcha. I just saw it was midnight, so I wasn't sure.
Yeah, we started kind of late. We had some guests over.
Okay, mass protest. This is going to be like mass protest from the past roughly month and change. So not all of this is necessarily recent. So first up here, Georgia. The protests against the government never really ended. We talked about protests, I think, in December last year, January this year. So they were particularly intense then, but they've kind of become more intermittent since then, but they've never stopped completely. And then a couple of weeks ago, there was a big spike. There was a big effort to get people out, and this time some of them decided to try and storm the presidential palace, which is a pretty brazen move. They did not succeed, but the fact that they tried it all turned into a big media stink in Georgia. I don't think anything really came of it, or at least I didn't read any updates about it. But I think it's worth mentioning that there is still notable unrest in Georgian politics. You know, the battle between Ivanishvili's party and sort of the pro-Western liberal reformers, that has not been resolved. That is an ongoing battle. Let's see, protests in Morocco. I kind of wanted to throw Morocco in here because I so rarely get to read about Morocco. So it's an excuse to talk about them. Let's see. So the impetus for the mass protests in Morocco recently occurred after, let's see, I'm checking my notes here. 8 women died giving birth in a public hospital in Agadir, which is a coastal city in Morocco. So that had people very upset because there were allegations of corruption, underfunding, et cetera, poor public services, what have you. Among the specific things that protest leadership has homed in on is, one, the government spending so much money on the 2030 FIFA World Cup, which apparently they're hosting. It always costs a lot of money to host a major international event like that. And in countries with issues with political corruption, a lot of that money ends up in the pockets of politically connected contractors, politicians, etc. So the protesters have homed in on that as an example of corruption that they would like dealt with. Let's see. Oh, also, there are just complaints of the government neglecting funding and oversight of healthcare and education just more broadly. Let's see. So there is actually a specific collective of protesters that are steering it. It seems they hesitate to say they lead it because, again, it is a collective. They're called Gen Z 212. And they organize themselves, unsurprisingly, on social media platforms like TikTok and Discord. And apparently their Discord now has over 200,000 followers. They don't really have clear-cut demands at this point. They did publish a letter to the King of Morocco with 3 demands, one of them dismissing the government, as well as, and this is me quoting, dismiss the government and corrupt political parties. That's kind of a broad demand. I don't know that I would recommend. If I had written it, I don't know that I would have gone with that. But that's what they decided to include among their demands. Get rid of the bad political parties. Second demand, release political detainees. And then 3, convene a national forum to bring corruption to account. That's another vague one there. Releasing political detainees, that's a pretty normal one. You pretty much see that all the time, especially in countries with relatively autocratic governments. But the other 2 could use some work. That definitely needs to be workshopped. But overall, not that surprising. They don't like corruption and they want the government to do something about it. That seems to be the gist of it. Now, as far as how things went after the protests picked up steam, they lost a little bit of support after looting and smashed storefronts. Kind of made the rounds on social media. So apparently that did hurt them a little bit. And the security forces responded by arresting, hundreds of people. So of course that's not helping either. Yeah, that's the latest update I have on it. I haven't heard anything in the past week or 2, so I don't know if that's an ongoing process or if they have been successfully suppressed. Let's see, and I did have some background notes here too. Like a lot of countries in the region, the Gen Z, people of that age cohort, make up the majority of the population. It's a very sort of fat-based population pyramid where everybody is very young, and correspondingly the population is growing relatively rapidly. Let's see, about 25% of the youth, let's call them, in Morocco are unemployed. And this encompasses, in this statistic, this specific data points case, we're including not just like outright unemployed, but also people who are in school or training. So this is the broader definition of unemployed. Overall, 35.8% are jobless. I'm not sure how that's distinct from unemployed here. But that includes
a number of hours worked to count as unemployed versus jobless, because you could have jobs that you sometimes take, so you do have some work, but it's not enough to count as employment.
Gotcha. Oh, I think it's the in school or training. So 25% of the youth population are either outright unemployed, don't have a job, but also are not in school or training. Mm-hmm. It goes even higher once you include school training. So people who are not just not doing any of those things, but if you include people who are in school or training, then it's 35.8%. I probably should have clarified that in my notes. Everything's just kind of splayed out. Let's see. Oh, and then I also had a particular note that prospects for moving up the social ladder, getting a job, etc., job prospects, in other words, those are worse outside of Morocco's core urban centers, where protests have been most heated. So basically, the protests have been the most intense in the most economically depressed parts of Morocco. Not all that surprising in the grand scheme of things. But apparently the urban areas do relatively well, and then everybody else kind of struggles. Correspondingly, the protests have drawn most of their support from those relatively rural areas. Okay. Did we talk about Madagascar at all?
No, not that I recall.
Oh, okay. This is an interesting one. This is something that kind of played out last weekend, but it hasn't really been heavily reported because, as we've discussed before, the broader world doesn't really care that much about Africa. So dramatic shit can happen in Africa and happen frequently, but 90% of people outside Africa won't end up hearing about it because most of the time it doesn't really affect them that much, and there's just not that much interest. So what happened in Madagascar is a coup. The government was overthrown, just outright, like old school style. You don't really seem too brazen that much like that anymore, or at least not up until recently. The Sahel is kind of a shit show, so there's been a whole bunch of coups up there. But if you ignore the Sahel, generally you don't see too many outright coups that much in Africa, at least not in the past 10 years. So this was a little bit of an aberration in that regard. The previous president had been in power since 2009. And so he had kind of overstayed his welcome, kind of an autocratic, not full authoritarian, totalitarian type state, but just one of those generic, poorly run, corrupt, autocratic type African states that's sort of common in the region. Ironically, he himself came to power as the result of a military coup, specifically by a special command called CAPSAT, which is kind of outside of the formal military. They're kind of irregular. They're basically Madagascar's special forces. At least that was the impression I got. So apparently they helped stage a coup in 2009 that brought the previous president to power. They have now done so again. Apparently they got tired of him, didn't want him around anymore, and took the initiative to kick him out. This kind of came out of growing unrest in Madagascar. The incumbent president had been getting more unpopular. The reasons why are just sort of the usual suspects. Inflation, which has been high since COVID, unemployment from an underperforming economy, and also just the fact that he'd been around forever. Again, 15, 16 some years. And he hadn't really clearly fixed anything in that time, and so people were just kind of sick of him. So he didn't really have a broad base of public support, which made him vulnerable now that the public was clearly turning on him. Part of the impetus here is that he ordered the military to fire on protesters. Maybe if not for that, they could just kind of overlook it. But when he actually ordered them to go in and disperse people violently, CAPSAT then decided that was the straw that broke the camel's back. And that's when they intervened. Apparently, they actually got into a firefight with some forces in the military that were loyal to the president. But CAPSAT apparently got the better of that and was able to mobilize and seize control of the presidential palace, take control of the media, etc. Again, just old school coup stuff. So after they did all of that, they announced formally that they had taken control of the military outright and that they were removing the president from power and basically, I think, putting him under house arrest. The president, for his part, said that it was a coup attempt, which, oh shit, Sherlock. Like everybody can see that pretty clearly. It's a little bit redundant. I hate to be sort of a backseat driver, but I can't really help but compare the president of Madagascar's response to the coup to Erdogan and his response to the coup attempt in Turkey back in, was it 2016, I think it was? So Erdogan not only went onto social media and said, oh, hey, it's a coup, obviously, but he also rallied his supporters to go out onto the streets, protest against the coup in order to try to shut it down. And it wasn't just, his core party apparatchiks who did that. He appealed to the broader public, and his voters, people, like the rank and file population who supported him, turned out, and they were able to kind of, through their collective efforts, stop the coup. So Erdogan played that very well. This guy did not. Like, this guy just was not able to kind of mobilize anybody to his support. Part of that is just because, again, he was very unpopular already, but it doesn't seem that he even really tried. So I rank his attempt 1 out of 5 stars. Very poor for him. He could have done much better. I guess that's what happens when you're in power for 16 years and just crush every potential challenger. You kind of get complacent and lazy. And that seems to have been the case here with this guy. He basically just announced, hey, that's a coup, you can't do that. And then just hasn't done anything since. He just kind of rolled over. So the new government has kind of set itself up a pace. There hasn't really been any issues. I don't think anybody really gave a shit. I haven't heard of like the US government or the French government or whomever really complaining about it, other than to give kind of token statements about, protecting their nationals and that kind of thing. Very boilerplate stuff. It doesn't really seem like it was it doesn't seem like responding to the coup was a priority at all for anybody. So the new government is not going to have any problems in that regard. I think everybody is just going to kind of collectively sigh and let it slide. I don't really know what the long-term implications are going to be, because I don't really know if Capset is just going to maintain a military junta that controls the country, or if they're going to do what they did back in 2009 and kind of hand power over to some kind of well-connected political elite of some sort, another politician, basically. Regardless, the ball is in their court, and also they've kind of established now the precedent that Capset has a de facto veto over the government. Once could be a fluke, but they've done it twice now, so pretty clear they're among the powers behind the scenes in Madagascar politics.
Okay. Madagascar is so spicy right now.
Yeah, relatively speaking, but again, like, the broader ramifications are so limited that it's not in the headlines at all, hardly. Mm-hmm. Maybe some mild disruption to the supply of vanilla. Beyond that, I'm not sure. I would think the French government would care more, because Madagascar is in their historical sphere of influence. And I think they've even got some troops deployed there still. But even the French government's response was pretty blasé. I think their attitude is that if the military wants to kind of intervene sometimes, then, that's their right. That's their prerogative. They're not going to make too much noise about it unless they get like really violent or start targeting French nationals or otherwise trying to challenge sort of the French role in the region. None of that seems to be the case, so Paris is fine with it. That's my impression anyway. Let's see, Ladakh. Have you ever heard of Ladakh? It's a province in India.
Nope.
Okay. Do you remember when Kashmir was, what's the word I want? Partitioned?
No, but I can believe that happened.
It would have been 2019, I want to say. I don't actually remember the specific year. Actually, before I forget, that's a good cue for the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have more of a background in foreign policy and economics. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please tell me if I'm wrong. I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it eventually. And we do enjoy the feedback we get on here. So that said, yeah, I want to say around 2019, Kashmir was partitioned into 3 new territories. One of them was just Kashmir still, but just without a big chunk of its territory. And then another bit was Ladakh. And then I think there was another one, but it's slipping my mind. Anyway, Ladakh was basically the Buddhist majority territory that had been in Kashmir. That was carved out of Kashmir and made into what's called a union territory. In India, you can think of union territories as being roughly equivalent to like Guam in the United States or the Northern Mariana Islands. You know, these are territories that are formally part of India, but they don't have full autonomy. So, like, Guam doesn't have all of the rights and privileges of an actual full American state, like Texas or Oklahoma or what have you. So, similarly, union territories in India do not have all of the rights and privileges of like a full state. And that's kind of where the problem is, because there had been activists in Ladakh before Kashmir was partitioned that wanted Ladakh to become a state. They wanted Ladakh to be separated from Kashmir so that the Buddhist population, the native ethnic Ladakh Buddhist population, could kind of run the state how they wanted and have more autonomy and discretion in local public policy. So they were actually pretty excited when the partition happened because they thought that was the direction they were going. However, they ended up disappointed because the Modi government determined that while they did want to break off Ladakh, they were not interested in actually making it a state. A union territory seems to be fine with them. And so that's where the mass protests recently stem from. They feel that the government betrayed them, failed to deliver on promises and whatnot by failing to turn Ladakh into an actual state. I would point out here that one of the defining characteristics of union territories is that the national government basically just runs you however it wants. You do get, I believe, like a national assembly, like a local legislature, but you don't get to form your own executive. And so the executive is actually appointed by the central government, and if you don't like what he does and how he runs things, pretty much fuck all you can do about it. Hmm. So being a union territory does kind of suck in that regard. It's not really all that democratic in the grand scheme of things. And so it's that aspect, the fact that they don't have full self-government, and along with the fact that they fully expected to get it after the partition, that is combined to make people very, very angry. And now there have been mass protests over the past couple of weeks in Ladakh correspondingly.
Interesting.
The Indian government is handling it with the usual grace and humility, i.e. none. They say that the protests are due to local agitators, specifically one particular activist who has been fighting for a more autonomous Ladakh government. His name is Sonam Wangchuk. I'm almost certainly mispronouncing that. He's been a major leader in the protest movement for years, and the government is basically just blaming him for the protests and refusing to really recognize their complaints and demands. Maybe if things continue, or if something happens to distract the media, maybe the Indian government will negotiate with them. But for now, it mostly just doesn't give a shit and has been trying to very militantly ignore them. And when I say militantly ignore, I mean they've been sicking the security forces on them. So that's not really ignoring, but I say ignoring because they haven't really cracked down per se. Like if you wanted a crackdown, you look at Kashmir. Kashmir has seen lots of security crackdowns over the past 50 years. And what the Indian government is doing in Ladakh in response to the protests is not nearly as violent as what they do in Kashmir. So it's relatively mild. And the fact that it's relatively mild suggests to me that New Delhi doesn't really care all that much about Ladakh. If they did, I think they would have cracked down much harder.
What's the economy there based on?
It's not much of an economy. You know, you can't even really say it's all that agricultural because there's just not that much fertile land there. So a good chunk of it is actually tourism. People come for the shrines because the headwaters of the Ganga are nearby. stuff like that. But there's really not a lot going on there. The population is very small. We're talking like, I think maybe 500,000 people, probably not even that. Let me check here. Ladakh population. Yeah, it's not even 500,000. It's 274,000, according to Wikipedia. So for India, that is very small. Even the less populous states in India generally have like tens of millions of people in them. So the fact that they've only got 250,000 illustrates just how kind of barren the land is. You can't have the kind of dense agriculture you see along, say, the Ganja or other parts of India. There's just so little arable land there that it can only support a very small population.
I believe it's the Ganges. Ganja is weed.
Is it?
Yeah. The Ganges River. Ganja is like cannabis. The chronic. Ganja.
I think it might be ganja in Hindi.
Oh, maybe.
You've got me curious now.
Well, we have all the weed emojis anyway, so that demographic is represented now. People go in there for the ganja far out.
Yeah, I could have sworn it, like the local pronunciation was ganja. Actually, maybe it's ganga. Maybe I was mispronouncing it. Ganges is like what Westerners call it. I am aware of that. That is technically the correct pronunciation, but I had thought ganja or ganga, whatever I was trying to remember, was also acceptable. But maybe I'm just wrong. It would not be the first time. I'll have to look that up later. I'm very curious about that. Let's see, what else do we have here? Tanzania. So Tanzania had elections recently, and they were not free or fair. Like the government of Tanzania has always had a pretty inconsistent relationship with democracy since independence in the 60s. So it's not necessarily surprising that the election was not free or fair. But in general, over the past couple decades, they had been leaning towards making it relatively freer and fairer than it had been in, say, the mid-late 20th century. But the current government has very much reversed that. For those of you not super dialed into Tanzanian politics, which is probably 99.9% of people, you might remember the president of Tanzania during the pandemic advocating for some quack cures to COVID-19, and then ironically dying of COVID-19.
Oh no.
Yeah. So he was replaced subsequently by, I don't have her name in front of me, but a woman, which is still relatively rare in Africa. It's still fairly conservative, so female politicians generally have a pretty tough glass ceiling, preventing them from rising too far. So it was pretty interesting to see a woman successfully win the battle to succeed this guy and come to the fore. I wasn't sure if she would stick around or not, but as it happens, she has. She's been in power since 2020. And she doesn't really have much patience for democracy. Her approach to dealing with dissent and opposition has been to have major opposition leaders harassed, sometimes disappeared, occasionally assassinated. Now, none of this is necessarily new to Tanzania, but again, she's been going harder than any previous president in Tanzania has for the past couple decades. So this does represent a form of regression. And the public recognizes that and is not happy about it. There were hopes ahead of the election in spite of the oppression, but obviously the outcome was never in doubt, and now that the election is over, people are spazzing out and hitting the streets. Some of the specific things I had in my notes here about how the government made the election unfair. Basically, there were three main opposition figures who were a substantive threat to the government, and none of them ended up being allowed to run in the election. One of them was barred from the ballot for technical reasons. Another was just outright arrested and jailed. And then another one was full on disqualified from running. So basically lawfare here, using the legal system as a way to, well, abusing the legal system, I should say, to prevent your rivals from actually running in the election. There were other parties running. There were 16 in total that were allowed to run against the incumbent. But they were allowed to run specifically because they were not a threat. These are all very small niche parties that have never managed to win a significant portion of the vote. And of course, this election was no exception. So I think the death toll from the government's retaliation to the mass protests is at about 400 right now. Although that number is probably a couple days old by now, so it's probably higher. I don't imagine mass protests will result in her stepping down unless they are able to significantly escalate. More likely, she's just going to kind of weather the storm until they tire out, and then things go back to something resembling status quo. But for the moment, the population is acting out and trying to fight for their rights. More credit to them. Let's see. So that's it. That's all I had for mass protests. The other stuff I have here is for elections. There's only really two of substance, and only one of them has actually happened. The other one just kind of talks about Syria's electoral system, which they've nominally set up. A bit to criticize there. I know they're trying their hardest, but they could have done it better. But anyway, we can save this if you want.
Sure, depending on energy and interest. Chat looked it up. Ganja is the personification of the Ganges River. So the goddess's name is Ganja. The river is the Ganges. But you were technically not wrong.
Well, that's the best way to not be wrong, technically.
Yeah. Technically, you can call it the Ganja and be correct because it is the goddess Ganja.
Okay, well, thank you, chat.
Yep.
I'll have to remember that, because I had somehow gotten it into my head that that was an acceptable alternative.
It might be.
Kind of, sort of.
Sort of. Acceptable.
Ganges. Let's see. We can do the election stuff. There's the trade update, which only ever gets bigger, but I don't know. The trade update is kind of esoteric at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really. I already kind of covered the highlights with the talking last time about the talks between Trump and Xi Jinping. There's like a mild update there, but for the most part, it's just little things here and there. So we can do that. We can do the elections. China's having a plenum. Do that.
Oh, what?
A plenum. They have it every couple of years. Basically, it's a formal meeting of the legislature. They get together and pretend to be an actual legislature, and then just kind of rubber stamp whatever it is the Politburo wants to do. It's an important meetup because the Politburo actually does take the opportunity to kind of outline and set the next couple years at least of strategy for how they want to deal with public policy issues. So China watchers generally pay close attention to the speeches and documentation around plenum in order to see how the party is thinking about public policy and to try to derive hints about what they might do in the future. So I think that just ended, and I haven't read analysis about what happened, so I don't have too much on that. I have more about some of the things that were expected of it, but nothing concrete. And then I still have economic data on the US and China, and then that whole inequality spiel.
Gotcha. You want to do elections?
Sure. Go back. Okay. If I can find it. There we go. So, the Netherlands had an election recently. And, the drama in Europe is sort of this waxing and waning battle between establishment political parties and populist political parties. So whenever there's an election, people kind of try to broadly gauge how each is doing based off of how well they do in individual elections. In general, the establishment parties have been doing relatively well, at least in Western Europe, over the past year and change. And it seems the recent election in the Netherlands cements that as the trend. Geert Wilders, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. Actually, I think it is Wilders, right? I think somebody's corrected me on that before. Geert Wilders, not Wilders. So he's a well-known populist politician in the Netherlands. Last year they had an election, and he was actually able to get enough votes for his party and like-minded parties to form a coalition. And that was the first time in the Netherlands that the sort of red line holding the populists out failed, and they ended up part of the government. In fact, I think he was the largest party in that government. The issue, though, is that, like a lot of large coalitions, it was unwieldy, and they had trouble agreeing on a common platform, a common approach to dealing with public policy problems. And eventually, the result is that the coalition collapsed. The way it collapsed is significant, which is that Wilders himself apparently just decided to blow it up. He ended negotiations unilaterally with his coalition partners, pulled out of the coalition, thereby forcing new elections. And, ending a coalition is not abnormal. Holding new elections after just having them a year before, that's not necessarily unusual. But egotistically, blowing up, sabotaging, ending negotiations, and then just forcing a new election without really consulting anybody, that's more the issue. That kind of cemented his reputation as a wild card who does not negotiate in good faith and can't be trusted. So that did a lot of damage to him, not only among his former coalition partners, but also with voters. He still did relatively well. The main opposition party, the center-right party, that ended up really being the big winner in the election, announced that they'd won before all of the results were in. And given the way the results were in at that point, Wilders himself actually conceded the election, gave them the call. But then more results came in, and the election ended up actually being much closer than had been anticipated. So he still did relatively well, but the issue is that Wilders is going to lose seats, and his coalition partners have basically just fucking disowned him. Like, even if he'd done better, it's unlikely he would have been able to join a new coalition just because he alienated so many former partners. Mm. So that's one big takeaway here. The other is that the establishment center-right party that was able to win the most votes is going to be able to at least fend off Dutch populists for another election cycle. Ideally, they'll be able to govern in a way that sort of restores confidence in mainstream establishment parties. Whether or not they can do that, who knows? Probably not. If historical precedent is any, from the past 10 years is any indication, but they'll have a shot at it. And so that is sort of easing some tension there amongst the anti-populist crowd in Europe. Again, we'll see what they do with it, but for now, everybody is just sort of pleasantly surprised that they were able to kind of do this. I don't think I have it in my notes here, but I do think I remember reading that the center-right party that did so well in this recent election had, as recently as I think 2024, or maybe even just a couple years ago, maybe further back, was basically a non-entity. They had been an establishment center-right party, but they'd lost so many votes that they were effectively irrelevant. So the fact that they were able to win as many seats as they have in this election, that's a big comeback victory for them. They were able to make a significant change there. see. So just for some context here, some of the issues in the election, usual suspects, immigration, overcrowded asylum centers, and the early 21st century favorite, housing costs. Seems to be an issue virtually everywhere at this point. And apparently it was housing costs that really tipped the election. That was the main one that apparently dominated debates. That's what I have in my notes anyway. Now, Jetton, who was the leader of the center-right party that ended up winning, apparently he was able to win favor by promising to deal with the housing crisis by constructing 11 new cities.
Whole ass cities?
That's apparently what he said.
Wow.
Quote, constructing, well, quoting from the article, promised to deal with housing by constructing 11 new cities to provide more housing.
Okay.
So I don't know what that's about, because I don't think the Netherlands can afford to do that, for one. That would be very expensive. Two, you don't really need to do that. If you can just build more housing. You don't have to build whole new cities. I mean, building whole new cities implies whole new economic drivers to provide jobs in those cities. That would be a huge undertaking. Like, I don't see how you do that. Mm-hmm. I think this would, if he actually did follow through with this, it would be like a much bigger economic experiment than just dealing with housing. So just as an economist, my immediate instinct here is, oh, he's bullshitting. There's no way he's going to solve that problem by just building new cities, whatever that might mean. Now, maybe he elaborated on it in the campaign, like during the election. The article I read about it didn't really have details. But even just hearing that, like, I have no idea what that could even be in practice. I've never heard of that floated as a, well, in general, I've never heard that floated as a solution to housing cost inflation. That kind of came out of left field for me. Building new houses, yes, I've heard that. But building new cities, that's a new one on me.
Ambitious.
Yeah. So I suspect then that if I'm right about that, he's going to end up disappointing his voters, because most likely he's not going to be able to successfully deal with housing cost inflation, which means that we're probably going to have another tense election where the populists are on the doorstep again in the Netherlands. The establishment will get a breather, but it's not likely to last. They've overpromised here. And if there's one thing that really gooses support for populist political parties, it's establishment parties overpromising and then under-delivering. So we'll see what long-term impact this has, but at the moment, it's a short-term victory. I'm starting to lose my voice a little bit. We might have to wrap up early.
That's all good. Take care of yourself. Has it started getting cold there yet in Texas?
Not really. What is it right now? 55 out? Yeah, it's gotten cooler, but it's still not especially cool, especially during certain days. But yeah, it's not summer anymore. It's not like 90 degrees or whatever. And I think it is supposed to get cooler relatively soon. He's looking forward to it. Texas in the fall is actually kind of nice.
Yep. I remember it being so.
Just the weather is decent. You can actually just kind of exist outside for long periods of time.
Not dying.
Not dying, yeah. It tends to rain relatively more in the fall. That's not for everybody, but I like it. And there's not nearly as much pollen. That's more of a North Texas thing. For those of you who don't know, North Texas is one of the worst places on the planet for people with pollen allergies, which I have.
Oh, no.
So the part of the year where the pollen count is the lowest, or at least relatively low, always going to be in my good graces. Easily one of my favorite seasons. So less pollen, less heat, more rain. Ideal combination. Texas becomes a passable place to live in. Generally doesn't last too long, unfortunately, but we appreciate it while it's here.
South Dakota has crazy huge temperature swings, so we're getting into our first winter where it'll get cold and snow, and then it'll probably get hot again before too long. But then it'll
Well,
get
I would
super
appreciate it if you guys up there would keep your Arctic fronts to yourself. We really don't need more of them getting down here again.
Yeah, I'm in the battleground between Canada and Mexico, sending their different temperature wind at each other.
Regrettably so.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was what was that? That was the big power outage, right? 21, I think it was, here in Texas. That stemmed from an Arctic front coming from Canada all the way down here. And that had actually happened 10 years before, way back when I was in grad school. I remember the one 10 years ago well, because that actually hit Dallas when I was sleeping in my fucking car. And I definitely felt that. That was so bad it woke me the fuck up. Like, I thought I was just going to sleep and then wake up and no problem, even if it was cold outside. But then when that front hit, I started freezing. I had to go back inside. It was so bad.
Yeah, I was really glad that your home still had electricity during that time period.
Yeah, we were one of the lucky ones.
Mm-hmm.
Very lucky. Yeah, I had some friends that had it out for like 2 days, something like that. 2 or 3 days. Some obscene bullshit.
Yep.
They said that they would kind of shake it up so that, you know, if one place didn't have power for a while, then they would have it restored and they would take it away from another place. And they did not actually do that. It became very apparent very quickly that wasn't happening. Lots of lies and bullshit in Texas.
Lies, damned lies, and statistics. Well, no rush on it, but did you end up looking at any PC parts or order anything yet?
Yeah, I did briefly review the outline that was given, but I haven't ordered anything yet. You know, my usual approach to ordering parts for the computer is to buy them when they're like on sale. So generally that means Black Friday or Cyber Monday.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's actually coming up pretty soon.
Yeah, it's coming up. Time flies. Can't believe 2025 is almost over.
Yeah. Well, that'd be cool. You can get some extra bang for your buck, maybe.
Yeah, that is the plan. That's what I try to do in order to economize as much as possible.
I've had a bit of a culture shock shift this year from being in LA before that to being out in South Dakota. It's very much kind of like the opponent's camp in a sense.
Pretty radically different, I'd imagine.
Yeah. I can get along pretty well with people, though. I'm not really going to try to pick a fight about some issue that we have a difference of opinion on. People are generally very committed to their stances on things if they're older than 25. I feel like the college people are the most malleable, where they're actively trying to explore different information and challenge their existing beliefs. So persuading them, you have a much higher chance than persuading someone who's like in their 40s, 50s, or 60s, where their prevailing worldview has served them up to that point. So it's more about them finding stability and affirmation rather than challenging like all the fundamentals of what they believe. People live in South Dakota? Yes, dozens of us. Dozens! It's not super high population. The summers can be really nice, but it's a brief, nice summer. And then it has a lot of windy weather, There's hail here. We don't really have tornadoes, but the winds can be high enough that it can knock trees over sometimes. So it doesn't have major natural disasters compared to places that are like prone to earthquakes or volcanoes or something. But I would say the weather that's below the disaster tier, there's more of that in South Dakota than in a lot of other places. And a lot of the wildlife here is even nomadic to kind of match that fluctuation. Like in the summer, you have a pretty wide variety of birds that are migrating there, and then different animals that'll come over for a few months and then they'll leave again in the winter because the winters here are very hostile. But the culture's pretty friendly. People are generally more warm and helpful than in a major city, so it's got more of that small town vibe, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, pretty nice place so far. I've put on 15 pounds of weight, probably more than that now, just muscle from changing my diet back, eating like meat and dairy and stuff like that again.
Gotcha.
Yep. Family calls me the garbage disposal, so I'll eat basically whatever. You didn't finish your plate? I got you. I got you.
Well, it sounds like you're thriving, enjoying yourself up there.
Yeah. We have a very close-knit nuclear family, so we all get along well with each other, so there isn't really too much strain or friction. Like, we all pitch in and help out and try to back each other up. So
Nice.
good team for sure.
Not getting in a fight with your mother about whether or not her boyfriend of the week can tell you what to do.
That sounds very specific.
Must be nice.
Yeah. If there was a boyfriend for the week, they wouldn't survive very long with my dad around, I'll tell you that.
He wasn't even that much older than me.
Oh, wow. We have Australian Shepherds out here as well, and it seems like pretty much perfect climate for them because they have a double layer fur coat, so they do pretty well with the snow. They just don't like rain. That's like the unfun thing for dogs is cold rain. But they get a lot of land that they can just run around freely on. They could technically run off the property, but they basically never do so. So they each have GPS collars so we could track where they go if they did happen to do that. But they basically always stay fairly close to home base. And I think that's some of just their herding instincts and how they've been bred to be protective of their people and their property, but not really too adventurous. Nature's pretty broad and it is scary in its own way for animals. Like there are cougars up here in South Dakota, and that's a really defining part of this town that I'm near. And there are mountain lions as well. So yeah, the dogs have to be careful. They are good dogs indeed. We have a cat here too. This is my brother's cat. He mainly helps with bugs that are inside. And cats and dogs are very different level of maintenance for how much they need to run around and do stuff.
Well, what kind of cat is he? Is he domestic or is he an outside cat?
He's a domestic cat. He has diabetes, so he can't really run like normally as cats do. He's pretty loud with his steps with his back foot. His back legs work, just not as well as a normal healthy cat. But he gets by fine. He ended up getting super skinny whenever he had cat diabetes, but ever since we've been giving him insulin shots, he has a healthy body weight now.
How old is he?
He's 14.
14. Wow.
Mm-hmm. Aussies are very needy. Yes, they are. They want to be with the people, like very adjacent to the people. They're not very solitary. So if you go inside, they want to go inside. If you go outside, they want to go outside. But if anything happens outside, they also want to go outside. And if they know something happening inside, they want inside. So, but we don't have doggy doors because it gets super hella cold in the winter. But they're good dogs overall. They were just barking and chasing away some deer tonight, which is really good for protecting our crops and stuff because deer will eat your plants and mess up your harvest. But cool,
Yeah,
I think we're... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna. We don't really get deer down here, specifically in Dallas. So the nature here is the usual sort of squirrels and all that kind of stuff. But
You do have
yeah,
armadillos.
I don't think I've ever seen an armadillo in Dallas.
Really? We had them right next to the nature preserve, and Michael had the apartment in Las Colinas. There was that super long trail next to it. There were heaps of armadillos over there.
Really?
Yeah, we saw a family of like 12 of them one time. They were just looking around for bugs and stuff in the grass. It was probably like 2 a.m. We were not sober.
That's over by Irving, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't really count though, because that's like nice, fancy. That's a nice, fancy area.
That's bougie.
Yeah, it's bougie. It really is, though. I think ExxonMobil has their headquarters out there. Like, that's the kind of area we're talking about. Yeah, I didn't grow up there. I grew up more like Carrollton and Oak Cliff. And yeah, I don't think in my entire life I've ever seen an armadillo in either of those places or anywhere else.
They're nocturnal, so if you don't get out at night, you won't see them.
Gotcha. Well, maybe that's it.
Yeah, a little random local ecology. I think we can probably wrap this here. Did you want to BG3 tonight, or is it a bit late?
No, I've been staying up late. It's fine.
Cool. Well, chat, thank you for your participation. Agent Smith, thank you for your time. Fuzzy Cold, thank you for handling questions. And we will see you all in the next episode of Well Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. Thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG!